form. It's a form of contract. Typically, when parties enter into the contract, they can either adopt the contract, the model form as it is, or they can amend it. And quite often people amend it to suit themselves, obviously, after negotiation. And if you don't read the contract as a distinct contract, as a discrete contract or as an independent contract, you might end up finding that you've breached parts of the contract, some of the clauses of the contract. So typically, FIDIC standard forms are tailored to each project. The amendments to the standard published FIDIC contracts are incorporated by the inclusion of particular conditions. So the general conditions of contracts in a FIDIC contract consist of standard conditions, but it also consists of particular conditions. And the particular conditions are typically amendments or additional requirements that have been added on top of the standard FIDIC conditions. So through the use of particular conditions, it's possible for the employer and the contractor to agree alternative risk-sharing arrangements before entering into the contracts. And just as an example, in the UAE, several government bodies and several developers, a lot of the developers, by the way, have customized FIDIC forms with their own particular amendments in the particular conditions, and they've adopted this for use as their standard contracts on construction projects. Obviously, in the UAE, FIDIC is very popular because nearly all projects in the UAE are delivered through international contractors anyway. Everybody there sort of comes from outside the UAE. So FIDIC forms are very, very widely adopted there. So as an example, a lot of the developers in Dubai, in particular, have standard construction contracts based on the FIDIC Red Book, which they use to procure and deliver their construction projects. And typically, the amendments that they make involve the transfer of risk from employer to the contractor, which is quite unfortunate. A lot of them have quite onerous clauses which they impose on the contractors. And we'll look in a second at a number of these typical amendments. It's interesting, a couple of years back in Dubai, during the era of when there was a huge construction boom, employers were imposing a lot of conditions on the contractors, but because contractors, obviously, they were eager to get work, they were sort of happy to take anything. And there was not much issue then. But when the economic collapse came around 2009 or 2010, and people started going back to the contracts to settle disputes, a lot of contractors found themselves short-changed because they hadn't read the contracts properly in the first place, and they then suddenly realized that there were a lot of the risk had been placed on them. A lot of the standard FIDIC conditions had been changed, had been amended, and a lot of risk had been transferred onto the contractor. So a lot of contractors actually lost a lot of money at that time, simply because the contract conditions had been amended. All right. Again, talking of particular conditions and amendments, etc., I just want to say that FIDIC on its own strongly recommends that the employer, the contractor, and anybody who is drafting the special provisions should have due regard to what they call 5 golden principles when making modifications. Unfortunately, FIDIC can't enforce this, so it's just a recommendation because they believe that by deviating from these golden principles, you're actually not implementing a contract that's in line with the intention of the producers of the FIDIC contracts. So the 5 golden principles, etc., first conditions must be drafted clearly and unambiguously. Now, obviously, FIDIC has gone to a large extent to ensure that the conditions of contracts in the different FIDIC books are very, very clear and very unambiguous and are not vague. Now, if they are going to be changed, FIDIC is saying that people should ensure that they are drafted very clearly and that the intention of the clauses is not ambiguous. You'll be surprised at the number of disputes that occur because people have different interpretations of a particular clause in the contract, and sometimes those clauses can actually go either way. And I've known arbitrators, different arbitrators giving different rulings on the same contract clause simply because it's not clear and could go either way. The provisional conditions must not change the balance of risk-reward allocation provided for in the general conditions, so that they should maintain the risk-reward allocation that's specified in the general conditions. Time periods specified in the contracts for contract participants to perform their obligations must be of reasonable duration, and this is very important. Very often, a lot of employers try to those contract periods to give themselves more time and to reduce the time for the contractor. All formal disputes must be referred to a disputes adjudication board, DAB, for a provisional binding decision as a condition precedent to arbitration. So FIDIC wants, before parties proceed to arbitration, to have gone first through the DAB process. FIDIC insists usually on this referral of disputes to DABs because they believe it's a way of reducing or avoiding disputes in the long run. All right, so just to give some examples of some changes that are typically made to FIDIC model contracts or forms of contract. Examples of changes typically made by the employer. The Abu Dhabi government forms, their contract forms, which they use in awarding contracts to contractors, are based on FIDIC 99, but they made some changes. And one of them is that the contractor has to be responsible for the design prepared by the owner, even if the design contains some errors. Now you can see that is, I suppose you might say it's not fair, but that is how they have changed the contract. This is obviously totally against the spirit of the golden principles which FIDIC stated, because FIDIC has stated that if you want to change the conditions, that you should maintain the risk-reward allocation there. However, FIDIC, the Abu Dhabi government's form makes it very, very clear, if you want a job from them, that the contractor is responsible for the design that they have prepared, even if the design contains some errors. The Abu Dhabi government forms also change the termination provisions in FIDIC 99 so that the employer can terminate on 14 days notice, whereas a contractor must take longer than that. So the employer can give the contractor 14 days notice to terminate the contract, and the contractor, I think it's about 28 days that the contractor gives. So obviously again, they've shifted the risk there to the contractor. Some contracts include express provisions whereby the contractor, and this is not the Abu Dhabi one, but some other contracts include express provisions whereby the contractor can't claim an extension of time for periods of employer delay that are concurrent with contractor culpable delays. Those of you who are familiar with the issue of extension of time, typically when the employer has caused a delay in the project, the contractor should be entitled to an extension of time. But what some employers do in amending the contract is that if at the time the employer delayed the project, if the contractor itself is in delay for whatever reason, then the contractor cannot claim an extension of time for that particular time period. Obviously, this is a very contentious issue, and some arbitrators sometimes tend to discount this amendment to the contract. So other typical amendments made by employers. FIDIC typically contains extensive programming requirements. In other words, stipulations and specifications for preparing the construction program, for submitting the construction program, for updating the construction program. However, it's not unusual to see employers rewriting this particular subclause or substantially amending it to provide additional programming obligations on the part of the contractor, including the requirement to provide electronic copies of the program, to agree on a baseline at the outset, which is required to be regularly updated, and to show the critical path as the project progresses. To be fair, I think employers are right to insist on this because it tends to help to avoid costly disputes over the time obligations of the contractor and of the employer actually when there is a delay. All right. Many contractors also seek to, well, a typical amendment made by contractors. So we've talked about examples of amendments made by employers. So examples of amendments made by contractors to FIDIC books. Contractors seek to delete the requirements in subclause 21 that notice of claims must be given not later than 28 days after the contractor becomes aware, or should have become aware. The reason why most of them are sort of resist this is because obviously this particular clause gives rise to what is potentially a time bar. So if, for example, something happens on the project, the engineer issues an instruction, or there is some additional scope of work that's instructed or whatever, and the contractor fails at that time to issue a notice of a claim for additional costs, or a notice of a claim for extension of time or for whatever arose from that engineer's instruction, the contractor could be time barred. In other words, it could lose its entitlement to being paid additional cost for that engineer's instruction. So a lot of contractors tend to resist this particular clause. Obviously, usually they don't succeed in getting it deleted. But I suppose in instances where they have leverage and they're able to get it deleted, they do get it deleted. Having said that, just from my own experience, and I don't know the experience of other people, but a lot of arbitrators, particularly in the Middle East, tend to disregard issues of time in relation to submitting notices. The Middle East, a lot of the Middle East countries are under what's called the civil code laws, which is sort of similar to the laws in France, Germany, and the European countries. But in addition to that, the principle of Sharia, which has what's called principles of fairness and stuff like that there, tends to look at some of these things as not being fair. Obviously, this is sometimes a personal thing, depending on who the arbitrator is or who the judge is, but they tend to look at some of these issues as not being fair, that just because the contractor forgot to submit a notice of claim, then he's lost all that money, kind of. So that's one example of a typical contractor amendment. All right, so now that we've had a look at FIDIC contracts in general, so we've had sort of like a typical overview of, FIDIC contracts, the structure of FIDIC contracts, and some of the typical issues arising from FIDIC contracts. As you probably imagine, with all the different FIDIC books and the content of a FIDIC contract, there's a limit to what we can sort of address within sort of like a 1 hour, 2 hour presentation. But I don't think that what I'm trying to do is to give an overview of some of the pertinent issues and pertinent provisions of FIDIC forms of contracts. So now we'll focus on the silver book, which is the FIDIC contract for EPC contracts, EPC and turnkey contracts, and which is actually the focus of today's presentation. So essentially, the silver book, as I said earlier, is intended for contracts on which the contractor is required to engineer, procure, and construct the required works. And then once the facility or the project is ready for operation, to hand over the keys, typically hand over the keys to the owner, so the owner may then operate the facility. And that's why it's called a turnkey contract. Essentially, the completed facility is handed over ready for operations at the turn of a key. In other words, everything has to be in place to the employer's requirements to satisfy the purpose for which the employer engaged the contractor onto the project in the first place. EPC contracts or turnkey contracts are typically used on process, power, and infrastructure projects where the contractor takes on full responsibility for the design and execution of the project. As I said earlier, risks for completion to time, cost, and quality are entirely transferred to the contractor. Now, obviously, to obtain this increased cost certainty, the contractor accepts a very, very high level of risk, or at the least a higher level of risk than is typical under most other forms of contracts. For example, as I said earlier, the Silver Book transfers the risk of ground conditions to the contractor. So if the contractor gets to the site and meets ground conditions that are totally different from what it priced for, then the risk is on the contractor. Similarly, the contractor in the Silver Book assumes responsibility for the accuracy of the employer's requirements. So if the employer made an error in defining its requirements, that risk falls onto the contractor, unfortunately. And because EPC contracts involve the contractor taking such a high level of risk, number one, they're received by contractors, but they're also more expensive because obviously the contractor prices in the cost of the risk into the contract price. That said, they are still the dominant model because sponsors and lenders prefer the certainty they offer. So there's a certain certainty there because they know that the risks are on the contractor and not on them. And most financial sponsors, a typical feature of EPC contracts is that you have a sponsor or a funding body involved, and they prefer that certainty in EPC contracts. So EPC contracts are the most common form of contracts used on major international infrastructure projects. Typically, a lot of the airports, for example, seaports, highways, etc., huge sort of building projects. A lot of them are delivered through EPC contracts, and they are delivered under EPC contract frameworks. The EPC contracts obligations typically require the contractor to deliver a completed facility at a guaranteed price by a guaranteed date, and which must perform to a specified level. It's of critical importance in such projects not only for the product to be delivered within time and cost constraints, but also to be delivered so that it is capable of meeting its design, production, and output levels. So a lot of the EPC projects are to do with power projects, for example, to do with water projects, etc. And not only should they be delivered within time and cost, but they must also be capable of performing to the whatever specified level is included in the contract. So if it's a power project, they'll probably specify that it has to produce a certain amount of megawatts per day or per month. If it's a water project, a certain quantity of water will be specified to be produced per month or per day. And it's critical that the facility that's produced is able to meet those production output levels. In EPC projects funded through project financing, performance of the asset is particularly key, as I said earlier, and lender security is dependent largely on the ability of the completed facility to operate and generate revenue, whether it's power, chemicals, road toll, whatever it is. And this is reflected in the general conditions of the FIDIC Silver Book, where the time for completion for the EPC project includes not only simply completing the works, but also includes achieving passing of the test on completion. So those tests are very, very critical in the context of an EPC project. Right, what I have up here is just to give an example or an idea of the sort of what I think are the complicated contractual arrangements on typical EPC projects. This is an example contractual structure of a power project. Purpose vehicle and those partners enter into an equity support agreement. You also have the lender who is providing the funding, or at least a significant part of the funding for the particular project. Sometimes the lender is also part of the equity partners in the project company. And obviously there are finance and security agreements in place between the lender and the project company. Now note that we as a year, we haven't yet even got to the EPC contract. We're just still talking about the different contractual agreements between the project company and the other project stakeholders. There's typically a contract, a long-term operations and maintenance contract for the entity that's going to operate the finished facility on a long-term project. There are different agreements for fuel supply, etc. And obviously there will be an agreement for off-taking, that those who are going to buy the electricity. Then there is the contract with the EPC contractor, the EPC contractor. Now, what I'm trying to get across with this sort of maze of contractual agreements is the fact that the EPC contracts has to be sensitive to the requirements of all these other contracts. And most of them obviously want as little risk as possible, which is why the Silver Book transfers a lot of that risk onto the contractor. So as could be seen from the contractual arrangement which I showed on the previous slide, it's very important that EPC contracts have a risk allocation that satisfy lenders who provide the project funding. It's a key requirement because the lenders obviously have to be satisfied that they are being protected from risk. In particular, they want certainty. That's the key thing. They want certainty that the project will be delivered to cost, the project will be delivered to time, that there will not be additional cost and additional time involved. And in this regards, lenders are typically concerned with issues such as the contractor's ability to claim additional cost and additional time, which explains why the risk of a lot of things are shifted onto the contractor, and the contractor is not able to claim additional cost and additional time for what would be considered to be normal things. So the contractor can't claim additional cost or additional time for errors in the employer's requirements or for unforeseen ground conditions and quite a number of other things. Obviously, the lenders will also need to be satisfied with technical risk, which has to do with the performance of the facility. The security of lenders is directly dependent on the ability of the constructed plants to operate properly and to generate the revenues, the required revenues. So all these key aspects are reflected in the general conditions of the FIDIC Silver Book. All right. So some key aspects of EPC contracts and how they are addressed in the FIDIC Silver Book. Firstly, single point of responsibility. As I said earlier, the contractor is responsible for all design, engineering, procurement, construction, commissioning, and testing activities. And not only responsible, but the contractor bears the liability for any risks that arise from this. If the EPC contractor is a joint venture, then the liability and the responsibility is joint between the parties to the joint venture. Fixed contract price, the lenders want to be certain of cost, so there's typically a fixed contract price, and as a result of that, there's limited opportunities for the contractor to claim extra cost and time. Their entitlement to variations is generally limited to specifically directed variations to the works, and the clauses in the Silver Book that address these are clauses 13.1, 14.1, and 20. Typically, they have a fixed completion date, which is a guaranteed date for completion. Failure to meet the date will attract liquidated damages. Basically, liquidated damages is an amount that's built into the contract such that when the contractor overruns or delays the work, they then have to pay this amount of money. This amount of money is deducted from their payments, the liquidated damages. In order for this to be enforceable in some jurisdictions, there have to be a genuine estimate of the loss that the project company will suffer if the facility is not completed in time. So clauses 8.2, which deals with delays, clause 13, which deals with variations, and clause 20, which deals with claims, all address this issue of the completion dates. All right, performance guarantees, another typical feature of EPC contracts. Obviously, project companies' revenue come from the project revenue. So the project company, that's the special purpose vehicle set up for the purpose of the EPC contract, relies on the project revenue, in particular to service the debts or the money it owes to the lenders. So it's vital that the facility performs in terms of output, efficiency, and reliability. And that's the performance of what's called performance liquidated damages, which are payable by the contractor if performance requirements are not met. So for example, if a power station that's meant to have an output of 5 megawatts, so if a power station has an output that is 5 megawatts less than the required performance, then there will be liquidated damages commensurate with this, which will compensate the project company for the loss of revenue by being unable to sell that 5 megawatts. Now, the Silver Book does not specifically provide for performance liquidated damages. However, it does say that the employer is entitled to claim money back from the contractor in the event that the project is not fit for purpose. So very often clause 9.4, which addresses this, is amended to include a specific requirements for performance liquidated damages. Right. Another aspect is caps on liability. Most EPC contractors will be against unlimited liability, as you would typically expect. They wouldn't want to be liable for everything that occurs on the project. But the usual practice is to put a cap at 100% of the contract price. So if anything occurs, the liability to which the contractor is exposed the default position in the silver book is 100% of the contract price. There are also caps of 20% sometimes on the contract price for delay and for performance liquidated damages. Contractors generally tend to negotiate to reduce this exposure on the cap on liability by reducing what the cap on liability is. Some exceptions are typically granted in the case of willful misconduct and breach of patent rights. So clause 17.6 in the FIDIC Silver Book addresses this. Security, and here we're talking about performance security. The EPC contract requires that performance security is applied by the contractor in respect of its obligations under the EPC contracts. And typical security instruments that are provided include things like bank guarantee for between sort of 5 to 50% of the contract price, a retention holding 5 to 15% of each payment, an advance payment guarantee where that is provided for, and a parent company guarantee as well. And clauses 4.2 and 14.3 of the Silver Book address these. All right, other aspects, issues of EPC contracts that are addressed in the Silver Book. Variations, which is sort of typical of any construction contract. Typically lenders and the other equity partners would want the project company to have the right to order variations and agree to suggested variations. So the clause for variations must also contemplate omission of work as well as pricing. Now, where this differs a bit from the red and yellow books is the fact that in the Silver Book, the responsibility for variations rests solely on the employer, whereas in yellow and red books, the contractor can also initiate variations. Defects liability, the contractors are required to repair defects 12 to 24 months following completion of performance testing. It can either be done in one period or over a staggered period of time, and clause 11 addresses this. Intellectual property, because the contractor designs a project and procures all the sort of specialist equipment, etc. Contractors typically would expect to own the intellectual property rights to the project. However, the employers typically expect the contractors to warrant that they have the rights regarding any of the solutions or any of the designs and patents. Because if the contractor does not own the rights, there could be a situation whereby the contractor is sued for breach, for copyright, and the employer would want to protect itself from being exposed to that copyright situations. So the contractor is required to warrant that it has the rights regarding any proposed solutions and any proposed patents, and this is incorporated in clause 17.5 of the Silver Book. Force majeure, we talked about that earlier on. Clause 19 specifies the force majeure events that the parties are excused from under the occurrence of those events. And the default force majeure events in the Silver Book are acts of war and acts of terrorism. But obviously during preparation of the contracts, both parties can agree on additional force majeure events, or to exclude some, by the way. Suspension, under the FIDIC Silver Book, only the project company has the right to suspend the contract, and this is contained in clauses 8.8 to 8.12. Termination, the contractor has very limited rights here. It can only terminate in situations of non-payment, an extended suspension period, or where there is a material breach by the employer. On the other hand, the project company has much broader rights, and these are often tied in with other third-party agreements that are stakeholders to the project. So, for example, the employer can terminate for convenience, can terminate for breach and insolvency. That's insolvency of the contractor. And this is in clause 15.5. All right, I just wanted to give another example of a project, an EPC project, and sort of the complexity of contractual arrangements there, and some of the implications of those contractual arrangements and how they affect the EPC contracts there. This is an independent water project. It's actually ongoing right now in Sohar. Sohar is in Oman, and the contract is for the performance of engineering, procurement and construction, EPC, of a desalination plant. The desal plant is located in Sohar Port Industrial Area in Oman. The scope of work requires the contractor to construct the seawater desalination plants for the purposes of the production and supply of potable water in accordance with the specs and conditions set out in the conditions of contract, and to maintain and operate the plant and make available a certain monthly capacity of potable water for sale to OPWP. Here is the Oman Power and Water Authority over a period of 20 years, commencing from the plant's commercial operation date, which is pretty much the date on which the facility is completed. So what we have here, sort of similar to the earlier example of the contractual arrangements on the power projects, is really a myriad of contractual arrangements, and you can easily see how risk can spread throughout this project and affect the EPC contract. So you have the project company. The project company has a water purchase agreement with OPWP, which is the authority that's in charge of water supply. The project company also has an agreement with SIPC. We talked right there. SIPC basically is the equivalent of the Port Authority, but essentially that agreement is to lease the land on which the desalination plant is being constructed or is being sited. So they have to lease the land. They have to enter into a formal agreement, which they call a sub-usufruct agreement, to lease that land over a period of time. And even whilst the construction is taking place, they have to comply with the requirements of the Ports Authority in undertaking the construction work. The project company also has to enter into electricity supply agreements with the relevant authority, the MJEC. And what they do, basically, they are the ones that will supply electricity to the desal plant. They are also the ones that will do the electrical connection. Water connections to individual consumers will be done by another authority, another entity. Then you have other agreements for seawater extraction, for industrial effluents from the plant as well. So that's you then have obviously you have commercial banks who are providing the finance for the project. You have, as part of those who have, as part of the sponsors, you have a water treatment company, a Spanish water treatment firm actually, and then you have some other investors. So all these investors together are equity partners in the project company. It's quite interesting here that the main equity partner for the project company is also the main equity partner for the EPC contractor. In other words, the EPC contractor is a project company, and there have been a lot of complications arising out of that. typically you'd expect that the project company and the EPC contractor are separate. Now, they are separate legal entities, but because they are one and the same, there's been a number of sort of complications. So you have similarly the operations and maintenance JV. Again, you have the same contractor there. The reason I'm showing you this really is because to buttress what I said earlier about the complexity of contractual relations that typically occur on an EPC project, and I'll just give an example as to how this has played out in this particular project. So in this particular project, the original time for completion specified in the contract was 755 days. However, the lender imposed a requirement that any delay to the project must not be more than 400 days, and they arrived at this after sort of going through all the different contractual requirements, all the different contractual agreements, after looking at all the different potential stakeholders and people who are participating in the project. So they said any delay to the project has to be less than 400 days, and as soon as the delay exceeds 400 days, they're going to stop providing money for the job, right? Which was a very, sort of onerous requirements imposed on the project. However, as soon as the contractor got to site, all sorts of things happened. First of all, they were not able to get the construction permit to start. In Oman, you can't start any construction permits, so any construction projects until the government gives you what's called a construction permit. They're not allowed to start it. Some people at risk, they go ahead and start it, but if you do, they can shut down the construction site and cause even more problems. So they got the construction permit late. They discovered groundwater contamination, which obviously had issues in regards to foundations, etc. There were reductions. The Soha Port Authority then reduced the width of the seawater pipeline corridor. That's the corridor in which the seawater pipeline that's pumping water from the ocean to the desal plant. And they also reduced the width of the site access corridor after they started. And then to compound it all, the utilities and service connections, after they started, the electricity authorities, etc., then said that they were unable to connect the plants at the dates which they had promised, and they delayed everything by a very significant amount of time. So as a result of all this, the project is currently in delay by 440 days. Now, you'd expect that if the contractor is able to get an extension of time, that will sort of bring down the delay. But a lot of these delay issues here are things for which the contractor has to bear the risk. They are bearing the risk of groundwater contamination, so any delay caused by that is basically theirs. The risk of construction permits is pretty much on them as well. The only risk here, which is not really on them, or which they're not liable for, was the risk arising from the availability of utilities and service connections. And our role on the project was we had to then advise, or we are currently advising on how to reduce the delay so that it gets under 440 days, so that the lender will continue to provide funding for the job. But it's just an example of the complexities on an EPC project, the complexities associated with the silver book, and why it's often said that only contractors with very sophisticated risk management techniques should actually use the silver book, or should go ahead with EPC projects. So the contractor is in delay by 440 days. A lot of these issues are things which under the red book or under the yellow book, the contractor is likely to have been able to get an extension of time. In this case, they're not likely to get an extension of time for a lot of these things, and they'll have to spend money to do a lot of things on site, and to bring down the delay to the satisfaction of the lenders. All right, so with the silver book, some typical examples of amendments and particular conditions that are introduced there. First of all, to do with warranties. Subclause 4.1 requires the contractor to deliver a facility that complies with the engineer's requirements and complies with defined specifications. Employers tend to replace this with a defined set of warranties, such that if the contractor is not able to achieve this, then those warranties are in place to compensate the employer. Performance security. Provisions relating to performance security are in subclause 4.2, and employers often amend this to protect themselves against the instability of the banking and financial institutions, basically by adding provisions that the institution providing the performance security should have a particular rating. So the bank or whatever it is required to have a rating of a certain rating from Moody's or Fitch and SAP, which are the typical financial rankings. And by adding related provisions as to what happens when a particular financial institution is downgraded in the ratings. Also, in the area of subcontracting, very often employers will look to amend the silver book to restrict subcontracting, for example, by providing that certain key equipment or materials are only provided from certain named subcontractors. So in other words, they typically tend to provide the contractor with a list of subcontractors that they consider are suitable and acceptable from which to source key equipment and materials. Now remember that in the silver book, the contractor is meant to be responsible for the entire design, procurement, etc. And that is reflected in the standard conditions that FIDIC has put there. But employers tend to often add these particular conditions where they restrict the subcontracting in this manner. Employers also reserve the right to give final approval to the terms of subcontracts